All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming back to the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. And we're excited to be back from Carnival season and talking about history again and non-Carnival history. So just a reminder that this is free to members. And then it's a small fee if you're not a member. So I hope that you can take advantage of this as a member. We usually do between 2 and 4 every single month. And we are booked all the way through June to June of 2022. So we've got a lot on our plate coming up, and we'll take a couple of weeks off for the summer, and then we'll get back started right after 4th of July. But we still have 9 or 10 more until 4th of July. So I hope that you'll take advantage of those. If you do, as we're going along, if you do have questions for Michael, please put them in the chat. And we will then I'll ask them at the end of Michael so that we can answer any of your questions you have. Tonight's speaker is an associate professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Rogers State University. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Dallas and a master's and PhD from Texas A&M University. And tonight we're going to be talking about his book, Instruments of Empire, Colonial Elites and U.S. Governance in Early Louisiana, 1803 to 1820. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Michael Beauchamp. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's Beauchamp, but that's okay.
Say it again.
It's Beauchamp, but Beauchamp probably
yes, I was doing the Southwest Louisiana way earlier, and then I got to it. So Beauchamp, Dr. Michael Beauchamp. So thank you, Michael, for being with us.
No, thank you for having me. It's so much fun. So I just want to talk a little bit about sort of what I was trying to do with the book, in that, looking at Louisiana and the Louisiana Purchase and sort of the problems or challenges that emerge for the United States for the first time, and that you're, bringing in over 50,000 primarily French-speaking peoples who've been granted the rights of citizenship by the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, but whom, within the Federalist Party and even within the Jeffersonian Republican Party, there's real doubts about how American these people could be. And no real history of self-government from an American perspective at the time. You're talking about an overwhelmingly Protestant country, and you're adding, this large Catholic population. And, that's something that you'd had a little bit of in sort of the old Northwest and the Illinois country, but that, not on this scale before. And, in a lot of ways, this sort of is reminiscent of what you see happening in Atlantic world histories or imperial histories when you're looking at changes in sovereignty, like you see in Spain, or in Spanish Florida to British Florida, back to Spanish Florida again, or what you see in British Acadia, or what you'd already seen in Louisiana, from the French to the Spanish, and then back to the French for half a minute, and then back to the Americans. And so in a lot of ways, it's sort of looking at U.S. territorial expansion in this sort of imperial context. And it works very similarly to how it does for European colonialism in the Americas, in that, different rules for different peoples, struggles with, establishing policies set in distant metropoles that don't often work on the ground. And in some ways, this is sort of a continuation too, in what comes afterward for the United States, when you talk about the United States in the American Southwest, or in Florida, or even in Utah, where you have Americans that are there, but a system of government and society that looks very different from what it had been in the Eastern United States. So trying to place kind of that territorial regime or territorial government in this sort of an imperial or Atlantic world sort of context. So that's one of the things I'm sort of trying to do. The other is sort of this idea of history from the middle, in that, I'm part of a third generation, and now we're onto a fourth generation that has this sort of history from below approach. And that's done a lot of good work in terms of, looking at peoples who'd been previously ignored. But in some ways, that sort of history from below model can be very limiting in terms of looking at how policy actually works. So, rather than looking at it from sort of, the high policymakers in Washington or from, people on the ground being affected by these policies, it's really looking at sort of where the rubber meets the road, right? Sort of, what public administration, studies talk a lot about implementing populations, right? Sort of the guys who have to actually implement those policies. So, the book's very much focused on local elites, right? Anglo-American appointees being sent, from the United States to take up these positions, people that are getting patronage, at the local parish level, sometimes as judges or justices of the peace, American Indian agents in Louisiana. And that seems to be, well, that I think is the sort of the key population, and that those are the individuals who have to try to enact these policies, often formulated in DC, on this foreign population in Louisiana. And that's something that I think a lot of middle-class Americans sort of immediately get, right? I mean, it's something that I get sort of as a teacher, right? I mean, every couple of years, there'll be some bright idea inside the administration, and then, well, wait, how does that work in the classroom? Or how do we make it work in the classroom? So I think looking at those local Anglo-American appointees coming from the East, and then local elites who the US is trying to get buy-in from, those are the key implementers. And whether you can implement a county system in or Louisiana or not, or whether you can implement the common law in Louisiana or not. And these are individuals that have to make compromises to actually make American governance work on the ground. And they regularly do, right? They're open to it. They're also, Jack Eblin, sort of earlier historian looking at territorial government, talked about sort of the oligarchical nature of US territorial government, that these are often, Eastern elites coming out West, but there's immediately kind of a modus vivendi with the local elites. They understand the sort of oligarchical government, right? They've already seen it from the Spanish. And building those bridges between those incoming American elites and local elites is one of the key ways in which territorial government works. It probably doesn't work without it. So, that's the other thing, right? Focusing on these local elites that often get ignored. Again, because either it's either from on high or it's history from below, but you're missing that key implementing population and the compromises they have to make, or when they don't make it, or when they slow walk things, right? Sometimes it's policies they know that are going to fail, and they're just waiting, until that message gets across to policymakers in Congress or in these Republican administrations from Jefferson to Madison. And then the third thing I'm trying to do is sort of go beyond New Orleans. Of course, New Orleans is terribly important, right? It's the political capital of the territory in the early state. It's the economic center of Louisiana throughout the 19th century. But only a third of the population lives there during the territorial period. And a lot of previous examinations tend to be very New Orleans centric. So, I'm looking at, those officials out in the parishes, the people being appointed as judges, as justices, and what's going on there to a much greater extent. And, then sort of making comparisons to what comes later, right? Sort of talking about how this is not a unique phenomenon, and that anyone who's been to Louisiana knows immediately it's unique, right? It strikes everyone as immediately unique, but its history in a lot of ways isn't, right? There's a lot of similarities to what's happening in Louisiana to what happens in other territories when it comes to issues over land titles, Native American relations, how you deal with a population that's different in terms of language or ethnicity or religion. So this is something that gets replicated again and again and again. And that was sort of, when I submitted this thing 10 years ago, and you were sort of having people read it, and a lot of people, well, hey, you need to put something in the introduction about how this is about America, that it's not just about Louisiana, it's about America, and that this is a model that you see elsewhere too. So I sort of put that in as a throwaway line in the introduction. And then, as you might imagine, right, when he comes back, the reviewers say, oh, no, you need to do more work on that. So I had to go back for years and read up all this territorial history everywhere else, sort of, and, like a lot of professors, right, that's something you tell your students every time, right? Hey, if you say you're going to do something, or you're claiming something, you better show it. But again, like a lot of, parents and teachers, I'm better at giving advice than taking it. But those comparisons, I think, made it in the end, hopefully, a stronger book, because you do see a lot of this stuff, reenacted again and again and again. And, looking at that map, you can kind of see, I mean, this is something that, again, you're encountering a large European population or Euro-American population in the Floridas. You see it there. You see it in the Southwest in terms of Spanish and then Mexican elites, whether you're talking about California or New Mexico or Texas, and the need to co-opt local elites there. You're talking about it in Utah. This is something that happens, consistently. And in some ways, this is one of the first times the U.S. encounters this, but the solutions they come to are ones that get replicated again and again. In some cases, because it's the same personnel, but more likely, it's just because this is how it has to work, right? This is how you have to get buy-in to actually govern these regions. And I sort of, the book's organized in sort of this topical approach that allows for this kind of analysis, and a narrative structure in some ways gives you a good story, and you have to be careful with the topical approach, because sometimes you can, you're covering the same time period and you can replicate it again and again. But by breaking it down into kind of discrete categories, it tries to sort of reveal how U.S. governance is working, how it's effective in Louisiana. So, the first chapter talks about these foreign threats, and you're talking about a Spanish boundary to the west with Spanish Texas at first after the Louisiana Purchase that's nebulous. Nobody knows exactly where it is. You're worried that Spain's trying to encourage out-migration of French speakers to Spanish Texas, which they are. You're worried about the Spanish trying to encourage native migration out of Louisiana and the southeastern United States into Texas too. You're also worried about Spanish territory to the east, right? I mean, Baton Rouge and the East Florida parishes, or the Florida parishes in Louisiana, to Mobile, still controlled by Spain until 1810, when you see a revolt there. So, there's a real security threat from the American perspective, from the West and from the East in Baton Rouge and Mobile. And it's also in some ways a threat to French speakers in Louisiana, in that runaway slaves regularly are fleeing to Spanish Nacogdoches. They're getting welcomed there. They seem to be being freed there. So, this is something that's affecting Louisiana planners, right? French-speaking planners, French-speaking elites too. So, there's that element. There's also worries initially about Spanish ties to locals in France. They'd been there for 40 years. And you've still got a lot of local elites that have ties across in Spanish Florida that still have contact with Spanish officials. You've got the Marquis de Casacalvo lingering in Louisiana for months after months, which is a huge concern to the incoming governor, W.C.C. Claiborne. He's really unhappy about this. And this isn't just sort of American paranoia, though there is a lot of American paranoia about Spain. We've got letters. There's a son of a former judge or a former commandant in Atacapa, Alexander de Clouet. And de Clouet is writing to the Spanish government just as the War of 1812 is getting underway, giving a list to the Spanish government of all the people in Louisiana who he thinks would be loyal to Spain if Spain would happen to invade. If they could invade from Spanish Texas and come up on the Gulf Coast at the same time. And some of those guys on that list are heavy hitters. Some of them are legislative council members. Some of them are people that had secured American patronage. And whether de Clouet's right in his assessment of who might be loyal to Spain or not, this isn't just American paranoia, right? There are these ties to, the previous Spanish government and some of those elites. So, that's what covers the foreign threat. You also got these issues with Native Americans, and in two ways, right? You've got still major tribes that can exercise real power on the ground, like the Caddo, like the Choctaw. And that's another way the U.S. government sort of prove its utility. And that, Dr. John Sibley and American traders out of Natchitoches, are regularly journeying into, that disputed border region to make contact with Native Americans there, to distribute gifts there, to try to earn Native American goodwill, or at a minimum, Native American neutrality if there was a war with Spain or if there were problems on that border. So that's one of these ways, right? I mean, the United States, seems like a legitimate source of power when it comes to dealing with substantial Native American tribes. You've also got Native American tribes that are sort of increasingly becoming reduced, right? That are essentially becoming kind of post-colonial minorities that no longer have real control over their own territory in Louisiana. And, visits to frontier communities, the kind of tensions you always see between settlers and Native Americans in the West taking land. And that's another way the US government tries to ensure greater stability and, barring Native American land sales, to private individuals. Exercising a kind of prudential justice when it comes to problems like this. So there's an incident where some Alabama Native Americans killed 2 Americans, and there were 4 assailants. The U.S. government ends up arresting those 4 assailants. They're tried by a jury, and then you have Claiborne going to talk to the Alabama, and Claiborne lays out this idea of American justice and how it's going to be done in line with the law, and that this is not going to be about diplomacy, and we're not going to be taking one head from you for everyone taken from us. So he lays this out, but after the speech, Claiborne immediately pardons 2 of the Native American assailants. So it is 2 for 2, right? I mean, again, there's 2 deaths. Claiborne pardons 2 of the 4 that are tried. And, that kind of diplomacy likewise resembles what's often happening in sort of these Native American borderlands when it comes with European powers. Again, there's a kind of prudence to how they deal with this. They're aware that this is always potentially a problem. You're also earning local goodwill in terms of slavery. And it's one of these things that I think you see it in Lo Faber's book on the same topic. There's sometimes a sense that the United States is implementing a harder slave regime from above. That's not really correct, right? And Faber and I sort of come on the same side in this, in that when you look at individuals calling for a tougher slave code in Louisiana, and when you get the Black Code in 1806, that's kind of a bottom-up piece of legislation. There's real local buy-in to that, right? Local planners, local elites want a tougher slave system. Local elites often are pushing you for even more when it comes to these issues on slavery, right? There's a lot of Louisiana resistance immediately after the transfer. They want to continue the international slave trade, right? The US Constitution doesn't allow you to bar the international slave trade until 1808, and Congress in 1807 passes a law saying they're going to do it in 1808. But Louisiana is a territory. Congress bars it in Louisiana before that. And there's immediately outrage from local elites in New Orleans and elsewhere saying, well, no, hold on. We were granted full rights as citizens. Why can't we make slave imports from outside the country if other states like, say, South Carolina can? You see, this is something that regularly gets reported up to Jefferson, that this is one of the things they want, and they're not willing to bend on that. Ending gradual emancipations or restricting them, which you had under the Spanish, right? So when you look at the Black Code of 1806, that's not something being driven primarily by Anglo-Americans coming in. That's something that is actually getting you elite goodwill, that is getting you sort of Creole support or Creole landowner support in a major way. And likewise, when it comes to the U.S. government trying to get slaves returned, when you have slaves, fleeing to Spanish territory, the U.S. government's relatively active in acting that or asking that those slaves be returned. Is this official Spanish policy? That's another way you're earning some local goodwill. When you think about the German Coast slave revolt in 1811, right, sort of probably the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, that's something that in the aftermath of, you see locals finally buying into tougher militia laws, something that Claiborne and the Americans had regularly been pushing, that we need, tougher militia laws, we need regular militia practices. The state or the territorial legislature had not been particularly amenable to a lot of that. After the German Coast slave revolt, they were. And even though the revolt's put down by local militia by and large, you've got the US Army presence there. You've got the US naval presence there. The US looks like a useful backstop in the case of a slave revolt. And once it's over, you also see one of these ways the administration's earning goodwill, and that, in the aftermath, there's a large number of executions, but there are a lot of local officials who had slaves caught up in this one way or another. So there's an initial phase where there's a lot of convictions and a lot of executions, but then you start seeing the territorial government saying, oh no, now it's time to start issuing pardons. Especially, or now's the time to start, exercising more clemency, especially for slaves that belong to major officials, in the German coast. So that's another way the U.S. is earning elite goodwill, right? It seems like an effective backer of the slave regime. And again, certainly Claiborne, who comes out of Virginia and Tennessee and Mississippi, understands these issues, right? I mean, understands the importance for planners within Louisiana. And, one of the ways in which Louisiana is unique is the large population of free persons of color after the cession. And that you've got other free color populations in the United States, to be sure, right? In Charleston, in New York, in Florida in particular, which is probably the best counterpart or comparison to what's happening in Louisiana. But there's a real opportunity for free persons of color in 1804, and that you've got the Free Persons of Color militia and others reaching out to the United States as they're coming in. They're issuing petitions asking that the militia or that militia be recognized. And to a lot of early American administrators, that looks like a pretty good bet. So, we know how this story works out, but they don't. And you could see why free persons of color might look to the United States that, talks a lot about natural rights. Is maybe a positive change. And you've got the local militia leader and official Pierre Bailey, who's a free person of color. He's one of the key leaders and signatures on that petition asking that it be recognized. And in a lot of ways, especially 1804, 1805, when there's a lot more doubts about local French speaker loyalty to the United States, which by 1808, that's kind of over, right? In the aftermath of the Burke conspiracy and the fact that you don't see any uprising, you've got a lot more faith in local elites. But in those first couple of years, that's not the case. And, hopes that the United States might allow free persons of color the vote. Hopes that the United States might continue to allow, emancipations or make them easier. And that's W.C.C. Claiborne, right? First governor who, hard to find anyone particularly impressed with him in 1804 or in 1808, right? The French commissioner Lassalle, sort of thinks he's, an idiot and sort of a joke. C.C. Robin was writing about this same time, likewise. But, I think in a lot of ways, Claiborne ends up being a pretty effective governor. And someone who's a good politician, right? He's someone who, again, naturally wants to please people. He naturally wants to find compromises. And he's relatively good at that. And you can tell that because he is elected in 1812, right? When it does become a state, he does win the governor's race. And that's not always the case for territorial governors who then actually try to become elected governors. There are cases where it goes completely the other way. So Claiborne, in a lot of ways, is doing real, a yeoman-like job in Louisiana. And, but You can see this quote. This is from James Wilkinson, who's the commanding general of the United States, to Henry Dearborn in 1803, Secretary of War. And this tells you that there's real interest in free persons of color, right? When you say that the jealousies of the people of color and the whites seem to be increasing, and if I may judge from what I see and hear, the former are most to be relied by us, for they have universally mounted the eagle in their hats and avow their attachment to the United States, while the latter still demonstrate their love for the mother country and do not conceal the fond hope that some incident of the depending war may return them to her bosom. I speak generally. The people of color are all armed. It is my opinion a single envious, artful, bold incendiary, by rousing their fears and exciting their hopes, might produce those horrible scenes of bloodshed and rapine which have been so frequently noticed in San Domingo. So, and again, that's typical, right? On the one hand, at this point, talking about how these individuals seem loyal. They're welcoming the United States. They're saying all the right things in ways in which, the French-speaking white population at first doesn't seem to be saying the right things. But then, the counterpart to that also, that if we don't win these individuals over, they may go to the other column, right? They may be a positive danger. And, you see this with Wilkinson, you see this with Claiborne. There's a real openness to this. When you have French petitioners, that want all these changes, that want to go back to the Paris system, that want to go back to, or away from the common law and back towards the civil law, you sometimes had free African Americans wanting to take part in those meetings. And that became a bit of an issue too, because the white-speaking French population did not want them in a meeting with them. They were refusing that. And Claiborne starts reaching out, and he regularly had private meetings with the leaders of the Free Persons of Color's militia and the rest, where he tended to try to exercise caution and sort of this gradualist approach with them. But those meetings became something that happened every couple of years. So there's a real interest in this. And it's one of these ways in which is you get more confidence in the French-speaking population of Louisiana, the white French-speaking population of Louisiana. That window of opportunity for free persons of color increasingly starts to close, right? So this, in some ways, sort of one of the real tragedies of this territorial government, and that there is a kind of openness to this population in those first couple of years that then begins to diminish significantly. But still, when you talk about, say, the Battle of New Orleans, you still have those militias there, and then you talk about the ways in which the United States ends up compromising on a lot of these points. So, trying to replicate U.S. institutions in Louisiana in some ways creates a lot of opposition. So, when you try to create a county system that proves a miserable failure, by 1807, you're right back to parishes, right? That shows a kind of flexibility to the U.S. approach that, okay, this is not what they want, we're going back to that. When you look at, the insistence that Louisianans have the common law system, that's terribly ineffective. When Claiborne does these tours out into the countryside, meets with local judges, they all say, no, it's not working, right? A lot of these judges appointed don't have any experience with that system. If they wanted to, brush up on it quickly, most of the major texts would be in English, and some of these appointees don't have a good sense of that. So you see the civil law reinstituted in 1811. So this is one of these things that you see a sort of flexibility. You see other ways in which U.S. institutions do get you some support. So when local merchants, both Anglo-Americans and French speakers, want a Bank of Louisiana, Claiborne says, okay. And you see the territorial legislature and the legislative council and Claiborne then begin to act on that. And, that's a big move for Claiborne, in that, he's a Jeffersonian Republican. They tended to be anti-bank, especially the southern wing of the party, anti-bank anyway. It also gets him in trouble with the Jefferson administration, and that, they want to have a branch of the Bank of the United States in New Orleans. Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin's very upset that you're setting up these local banks. But that does earn you some goodwill from that mercantile elite. When you see Anglo-Americans pushing for something more like a public education system, even though nothing comes of it really, but still that's a way in which they seem to be proactive. And likewise, when they start talking about, trying to find ways to reduce yellow fever, better sanitation, draining some of that water. Again, not a lot happens on that, but it's the Anglo-American or it's the Claiborne government that's often at least talking about it. Again, tougher militia in case there is an invasion, in case there is a slave revolt. So some of these U.S. institutions are getting you goodwill. The ones that aren't, they prove very flexible on. Same thing when it comes to land titles, right? I mean, you've got a US government that on the one hand wants everyone to register their land titles to make sure everything's above board. And, to be sure, in those last days of the Spanish administration, you saw a lot of large land grants being given away to individuals who hadn't settled them, who weren't on them. It looks suspicious, but one of the things you see throughout the territorial period is Claiborne and others in the territorial government regularly saying, we need to give very liberally, especially when it comes to small farmers. So the worst abusers, right? Guys who got thousands or hundreds of acres in the last weeks of the Spanish administration, sure, look at those skeptically, but we don't want to be taking land away or voiding titles for people that actually seem to be on them, that are inhabiting that land, farming that land, that have been there, and regularly asking for extensions too, because you often have individuals who don't want to come in and register that land. They're suspicious it's going to be taken away from them. They might not, again, want to deal with the US government in this way, but you see the United States on the ground, the territorial government regularly saying, oh, no, we need to give them more time. We need to give them extensions. We want local land boards that have locals on them overseeing this. So it's being done to at least some extent by their neighbors, not from people being sent out of Washington, D.C., who might not have a lot of local trust. And then that last chapter really looks at personnel. And, so much of this is, the book is, personnel matters more than policy. And trying to get the right individuals appointed in the parishes as judges, trying to get local elite buy-in. And, in general, the trend you usually see is in southern Louisiana, you see a lot of local elites appointed, a lot of French-speaking elites appointed. When you look at northern Louisiana or western Louisiana on the boundary with Spain, those first couple of years, you've actually got military officers appointed as commandants, and then a couple of them go on to be judges in western Louisiana. But that's a national security concern. But you're trying to get buy-in from these elites by distributing these jobs. And you're also trying to earn their goodwill. And in some ways, it's sort of as long as the forms are being obeyed, it can still be business as usual, or getting local elites to understand it can still be business as usual. So, you've got a case where a local judge ends up having his son-in-law put on trial for assault and battery. And the judge then convicts his son-in-law, and he gives him a fine and some time in jail. And Claiborne writes at length about this to Jefferson, that this shows that we're getting elite buy-in, that this shows they understand the American form of government, that it's not going to be local elites just benefiting themselves, and that this shows this sort of transformation, and that this is such a success. And that's what you're writing to Jefferson. But Claiborne turns around and pardons the son-in-law, right? So, I mean, that's typical of how a lot of things are working, right? Again, you've got these mandates coming down from DC or Washington, and you want to demonstrate to Jefferson that you're doing the job and that this place is becoming much more Americanized. And to a certain extent, that's true, but you also have to be incredibly flexible in all this. And again, getting those right people appointed. It's something too that similar to Peter Castor that wrote about this 2 decades or a decade and a half before I did. What you see is not usually tensions in the parish that are between French speakers and Anglo-Americans. The tensions you see in the parishes are usually between insiders versus outsiders, right? Or court versus country, right? People who have ties to Claiborne and are getting these appointments, whether they're French speakers or English speakers, and then people that are not. And those outsiders, likewise, are a coalition of French speakers and Anglo-Americans. And a lot of the key disputes in the parishes, when you go into it parish by parish, they're often between Anglo-Americans that are getting appointments and Anglo-Americans that are not getting appointments, right? Anglo-Americans who feel like, they don't have enough influence to get the appointment, and they're angry that it went to somebody else, whether that person be a French speaker or an English speaker. So, in general, it's personnel matters more than policy, right? And over time, you're getting this sort of buy-in. And this is one of these things that Claiborne's very good at, right? He's good at balancing patronage to disperse it among local elites, also giving it to people, because again, he's got recommendations coming down from the Jefferson administration and people who have friends in Congress regularly. Sometimes people who have more influence in Congress than, say, Claiborne would. You've got to get them or find them places too, but not to the exclusion of locals in such a way that it might hurt U.S. administration within the territory. So that's the book in brief, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Not sure what happened there, Michael, but we're good to go.
Okay. So did you not hear everything?
I'm not sure what just happened. It just cut out there real quickly, but we lost your share screen.
Oh no, I did that. I was done. Okay. I'm ready to take questions.
Fantastic. Sorry, I just popped over it for a second there.
Okay.
So you're asking for questions now?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. I want to start. We got a couple questions, but the first one I wanted to ask was about Claiborne's scene in history. I mean, it's from the way you're talking about him today. I mean, he seems to be a pivotal player in the creation of basically, I'm not just Louisiana, but for setting the tone for America being in this part of the world. Do you think that he is seen really as where he's recognized as much as he has should be viewed as and recognized, or do you think that his place is basically where it should be?
No, I guess I'm a Claiborne fan, right, in that regard. Yeah. I mean, I think that he's doing a much better job than anybody expected. And not that he's a sort of major figure. And there's certainly a lot of missteps in dealing with Wilkinson, and then, criticism in terms of how he's dealing with Jackson, too, during the War of 1812. But, this is someone who they want a higher profile person in some ways, right? The Jefferson administration sort of toys with the idea of, well, could we have Lafayette come over and do this job? And they briefly, talk about James Monroe maybe doing this job. And Monroe doesn't want to do this job. He doesn't see this as a future in politics. So, Claiborne had been a loyal Republican. He's somebody who had done this job in Mississippi too, right? He'd been the territorial governor in Mississippi. And it's a lot of the same problems, right? I mean, it's a lot of the same issues when it comes to dealing with Native Americans, dealing with the slave regime, dealing with local elites that, were new to the US system. So, I mean, he'd already done this. And, the fact that he doesn't speak French coming in is a huge problem. The fact that, and even by the end, his French is not great, right? But I mean, it's sort of hard to argue with the success, right? If the test is, do you get elected afterward or not? And he does get elected. So, I mean, I think in some ways, over time, he is earning enough goodwill to put together something like a majority coalition.
And you said that Monroe didn't see it as a long-term political advantage for him to, come down here. Do you think that Claiborne saw it as, I'm going to be able to create my own little fiefdom kind of thing down here, even though he doesn't speak French, which is, kind of hard?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about future. I think he certainly thinks there's a political future for him if he goes down there. Yeah, and he'd done it. And again, he'd been elected to Congress before he was even old enough to be in Congress, right? I mean, he hadn't hit the age limit yet, and then his birthday turned. He'd supported Jefferson in the 1800 election. So I mean, he's someone who had the party credentials as a loyalist to Jefferson, and they do talk about replacing him, right? There are multiple points where Jefferson and Madison sort of toy with the idea of bringing someone else in, but there's just not a likely candidate that seems necessarily any better.
Yvette Rubio asks, how accurate are some of the most popular depictions of French resistance towards Americans, such as G.W. Cave? And if so, how long did it really last?
Yeah, I think it's more popular in terms of the cultural perception or sort of the history, and that you do see a lot of governmental cooperation between these elites, and you also see a fair amount of cooperation between French-speaking merchants in New Orleans and Americans coming in. And in some ways, it's less, I mean, there's a lot of verbiage about it, but it's not as prevalent as it actually becomes by the Jacksonian period. So at this point, the politics tend to revolve around ins versus outs, and the outs tend to be both Anglo-Americans and French speakers, and the ins tend to be both Anglo-Americans and French speakers. Now, by the time you get to the age of Jackson, the politics are, kind of the Tregel, it is sort of taking on more this ethnocultural element than it had been in the past. And it's also because there's no elections until 1812, so there's no point in sort of using that to get votes necessarily. It's not going to. So you can see it, but I don't think it's that important in terms of how they're running the territorial government, because they are going out of their way to find prominent French-speaking elites for a lot of these positions. So a more democratic style of politics actually makes this worse in terms of the ethnocultural parties.
Tamara Carboni says, to what extent did the threat of British takeover influence the acceptance of the U.S. governance among the Creole population?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that, like when you look at the Battle of New Orleans, again, you can find people on both sides of this, right? I mean, again, I think in the aftermath of the Battle of New Orleans, it sort of seems like Louisianans coming together, and that's sort of a nice vision of history, because it's French speakers and English speakers and whites and blacks and everyone together in that. But there's plenty of French speakers trying to go to the French consul to say, oh, we don't have to serve, right? I mean, Jackson's furious at what he sees. Jackson certainly detects a lot of disloyalty there. So I think that cuts both ways, right? I think there's some of it. And, in Jackson's speeches, sometimes these are the traditional enemies of your country, and you should be siding with us in this. And yeah, so some, it probably helps with some, but not all, I guess.
Yeah. All right. If anybody, here we go. We got a couple questions that popped in there. Hold on, a little longer one. Yvette asks, also I've read something online of Jefferson's notes when he visited Louisiana, and he didn't seem to have a very high opinion of most of the elites he met. And is that true? For example, in his notes, he writes this about one of my ancestors, quote, his understanding is much below mediocrity, but he may be honest and is certainly hospitable. Eating and drinking are his forte.
Well, Jefferson actually never went. I mean, as interested as Jefferson was in the West, he never really went to the West, right? He's someone who's obsessed with this information. That seems very, I mean, I think there's sort of a stereotype about a lot of Americans talking about the eating and drinking and sort of what they see as maybe the weaknesses of sort of these French elites that they like to have too good I mean, I think that's maybe, yeah, kind of a puritanical streak, or sort of a Protestant versus Catholic streak in terms of looking at the culture. So there's some of that there. Some of it's also sort of Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson's always hard to get your head around, right? Because I mean, you can't find anyone who's more elite in terms of his own habits and his own pedigree, but that it also has this weird obsession with the yeoman farmer and democracy. So Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the complexity of Jefferson, right? That he often portrays himself as an anti-elitist, even though you'd be hard pressed to find anyone more elite.
um, we're on a Jefferson streak here. How did Jefferson's implementation of the Embargo Act negatively affect his interest to cultivate goodwill with the local residents of the Louisiana Territory?
A bit. And it's one of these things with not just Louisiana, but the entire Gulf Coast. There's just too many inlets. There's no way you can stop smuggling from coming in. And this is a huge problem in Louisiana, and that, the Embargo Act's there, but your regular, and, also slaves, right? Again, you're not supposed to have slaves coming in from abroad, but there's consistently slaves coming into Louisiana, being smuggled in, right? Lafitte specializing sometimes, and they're writing about, so yeah, the Embargo Act in some ways, it would be hard for that to earn you goodwill anywhere anyone's trading, right? New England merchants don't like it. Merchants in the Gulf Coast don't like it. At the same time, it's so hard to enforce that if they're more capable of enforcing it, it would probably be worse, right? In some ways, one of the reasons why it's not as big a deal as it is that everyone's violating it.
Very good. Very good questions, everybody. Yeah. They came prepared.
Yeah, it's always a lot of questions when you get Louisiana audiences for this book. Yeah.
All right, good. I think that's all we have in there. I did want to, add the link in there, and I want to add it one more time to directly to LSU Press's page if you'd like to purchase the book. Michael, I want to thank you so much for speaking tonight. We really appreciate you coming in and providing really great content tonight. And next week we'll have actually LSU's Alicia Long talking about her new book, Cruising for Conspirators, how a New Orleans DA prosecuted the Kennedy assassination as a sex crime. So we are really strangling different centuries right now. So Michael, I want to thank you so much for the lecture, and thank you everybody for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. It was great.
It was very good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.